Welcome, dear students. In the current session, we are going to talk about language during Renaissance period with particular focus on noun, adjective, and pronoun. I hope by the end of this session, you would be able to understand the nature of all these three during that period. Coming towards noun, well, the only inflections retained in the noun were those that marked the plural and the possessive singular. You know, if you go back in the history, you would realize Middle English time had a lot of inflections. By this time, they were removed and we have only a few left. S plurals, making of the plurals when we talk of that, S plurals had become generalized, except for a few nouns like, for example, this sheep or swine. That would not have the plurals with S. Most of the times, S would be used. By now, this had become a standard practice. And only a few other, like, for example, from mouse to mice or from foot to feet, the plurals would be made. But otherwise, S would be a general rule. In the 16th century, my dear students, however, there are certain survivals of the old weak plural of N. Like the word we have now, oxen, in modern times. So, mostly the shift to S forms happened, for example, from the word foe, when the plural would be made, fawn instead of foes. For knee, instead of knees, neen. For fleece, fleen. So this is how it was still retained. All modern forms, that we find of making plurals, we have their history or their roots in these times. However, sometimes, some words with, as I said, this movement that was taking place from Middle English to, Renaissance time, Middle English fawn to foes of Renaissance time did not happen. Sometimes these forms would be used. So here are examples, for example, from Shakespeare, who used the words eyne instead of eyes and who used the word shoon instead of shoes. We can compare these with the words today, children, brethren, or as I have already said, oxen. An interesting peculiarity of the times is his genitive. My dear students, in the Middle English times, this es ending of the genitive being unaccented was frequently written and pronounced as is. The pronunciation was is. The ending was thus often identical to the, pronoun his, which commonly lost its her when unstressed. So his or is were same. The adjective had already lost its endings. No longer it expressed distinctions of gender or number and case as it was the case in Middle English. Mainly the chief interest was in the forms of the comparative and superlative degrees that would be, made by adding ER or EST. Actually, these two methods were popular since Old English times, and ER and EST would be used, for example, great, greater, greatest. With the adverbs, sometimes, however, more and most would be used. For example, more interesting, most interesting. But, of course, this was the variety that existed. In Shakespeare, we find some very interesting examples. Please notice. Honester. We do not use it now. We say more honest or most honest. We do not say honester or, for that matter, honestest. We do not. Violentest. Even it is difficult to pronounce. This is what Shakespeare used. We say most violent. The most violent, actually, we use. Double comparatives were also used by Shakespeare that we do not use now. For example, more, larger, more, boldest, etc. We do not use them in modern English. And actually, when, Mark Antony says, this was the most unkindest cut of all, this kind of language now, today, is not acceptable. the chief development that affected the adjective in the modern times actually has gradually grown through this same rule of ER and EST at the endings. When we come to the pronoun, actually the establishment of the personal pronoun in the form that it has today has its roots there. 3 changes were involved. Disuse of thou, thy, and thee was the first change that was involved. Substitution of you with ye as a nominative case was the second, factor. And the third change that was involved was introduction of its as a possessive. Its cover, as we translate it in Urdu, iska cover, the possessive form that is reflected as ka, ke, ki in Urdu. That its. Otherwise, we used in the Middle English, we had it for that, for the possessive. We did not have its. In the earlier period of the English history, actually, this distinction between thou and ye was simply one of the numbers, and actually ye was used for the plural, thou was used, otherwise. However, with the passing of the time, this distinction has disappeared. My dear students, actually, if we go back to 13th century, singular forms, all the 3, thou, thy, and thee forms were used for, familiar situations among people we are familiar with, or with children, or with people of inferior rank. But for plurals, ye, your, and you began to be used for respect for superiors. This new possessive, its, is a neuter that was introduced during this time, and that is important development in terms of language. In unstressed positions, hit was pronounced as hit. So it was like it. And for the first time, its was, by the way, introduced. And what I want you to notice is the use by Shakespeare. If you look at the screen, you would notice here, in fact, on the screen, this is from a speech from the famous work Hamlet by Shakespeare. And actually, when Horatio describes the ghost in a scene, this is where this use of it is important for us to notice. Shakespeare writes, "It lifted up its head." Now, this it is okay for us in the modern times, but we are not okay with this one. It should have been its. Why? Because the possessive form is not indicated here. There is another example in Shakespeare with reference to that. So when the fool, for example, in King Lear talks, he says, "The hedge sparrow fed the cuckoo so long that it had its head bit off by it young." Now, what you need to notice is, it here, this first one, is all right, that it had. But this should be its, that it had its head bit off by its young. So, both of these are possessive neuters of its that are otherwise written just as it by Shakespeare. So, my dear students, actually, Renaissance had a very strong impact on the language of the times. So, the impact on nouns and adjectives and pronouns was also predominantly present.